October 17th, 2014. A cold wind pushed dust across Main Street in Elk River, Montana, while people gathered quietly outside the First National Bank. Some pretended they were only passing by. Others stood with coffee cups in their hands, staring through the windows. But everyone in town knew why they were there. That morning, Elias Turner was selling the last 73 acres his family had owned since 1946. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, the old farmer looked smaller than the land behind him. His denim jacket was faded from decades of weather. Mud still clung to the edges of his boots. His rough hands looked more suited for repairing engines than signing legal papers. Across the sidewalk stood Carter Hale, beside a black Cadillac, polished so clean it reflected the gray Montana sky. Carter owned grain contracts, transport companies, fuel stations, and half the commercial property surrounding Elk River. He had wanted the Turner land for years, not because he cared about farming, but because the northern ridge beneath the property connected to valuable limestone deposits. "Well," Carter said loudly as Elias approached the entrance, "looks like reality finally caught up with you." Several men standing nearby laughed quietly. "You spent your whole life protecting broken tractors and dead dirt," Carter continued. "Now you're selling it anyway." Elias stopped for a moment with one hand on the bank door. People expected him to argue, but he only looked at Carter calmly. "My daughter's alive," he said softly. "That's all that matters." Then he walked inside, and suddenly the laughter did not sound as confident anymore, because everyone in Elk River knew about Clara Turner. 3 weeks earlier, she had collapsed at work after her heart condition worsened unexpectedly. Doctors in Minneapolis said surgery could save her life. But Elias needed more money than the farm had earned in years. Insurance covered almost nothing. He had already borrowed against his equipment. Even the old Ford tractor sitting behind the barn, especially that tractor. Most people in town mocked the machine constantly. A faded blue 1951 Ford with patched fenders, welded steel brackets, and an engine that sounded older than the mountains themselves. Carter once called it a museum piece pretending to be useful. But Elias still started it every morning before sunrise, because to him, the tractor was not scrap metal. It was memory. It was family. And somehow, though nobody understood it yet, it was connected to the secret buried beneath the Turner land. Inside the bank office, papers weighted neatly across a polished wooden desk. The attorney adjusted his glasses nervously. "Mr. Turner," he said carefully, "once these documents are signed, the transfer becomes permanent." Elias looked down at the papers. The farmhouse, the orchard, the machine shed, the north field, everything his father built after returning home from World War II. Gone in a few signatures. Carter leaned against the wall comfortably. "You could have sold years ago and retired peacefully," he said. "Instead, you wasted your life hanging on to old junk." Elias signed the first paper, then the second. Each scratch of the pen sounded heavier than the last. And while the others watched an old farmer surrendering, Elias remembered another night entirely. Winter of 1962. He had been 11 years old when his father, Walter Turner, woke him during a blizzard and drove toward the North Ridge with several strange wooden crates loaded behind the tractor. Walter had been a military mechanic before becoming a farmer. Quiet man, burned scars on both hands, never smiled much. That night, 2 strangers waited near the field beside a deep trench hidden beneath tarps. Elias remembered hearing metal echo underground, while the men lowered the crates into darkness before covering the trench. Walter looked directly at his son and said something Elias never forgot. "Never let anybody dig deep on this land." At the time, Elias thought the old man was simply protecting buried machinery. Now, standing inside the bank 50 years later, those words suddenly felt much heavier. When the final document was signed, Carter smiled immediately. "There we go," he said proudly. Outside, people watched Elias leave the bank carrying nothing except his old cap in one hand. Nobody laughed now. Humiliation becomes quieter once it turns real. 3 days later, excavation crews arrived at the Turner farm before sunrise. Bulldozers rolled across frozen ground, while engineers placed survey markers near the northern ridge. Carter planned to flatten part of the property before winter and begin industrial extraction by spring. The old Turner sign near the gate was already gone. Since 1946, erased. Then the strange problems began. Drill heads snapped underground. Sensors returned impossible readings. Machines stalled without explanation. And on the second morning, an excavator struck something solid beneath the north field. The impact rang across the land like a giant bell under the earth. Workers climbed into the trench expecting old pipes or fuel tanks. Instead, they uncovered a massive steel surface buried 14 feet underground. Smooth, manufactured, intentional. One operator brushed away frozen dirt with shaking hands. Then he looked upward slowly. "You better call Hale." By evening, trucks lined the road leading to the farm, while rumors spread through Elk River faster than wildfire. Military bunker, Cold War storage, buried government equipment. Nobody knew the truth, not even Carter. Floodlights illuminated the excavation site deep into the night, while engineers argued beside the trench. One younger engineer pointed nervously toward the steel structure. "This wasn't supposed to be here." Carter rolled his eyes. "It's Montana," he snapped. "Not Area 51. But nobody laughed this time, because partially exposed beneath the frozen ground was a gigantic steel hatch stamped with faded government markings from 1953. And when Elias finally returned from the hospital and stepped beside the trench, his face changed instantly, because welded into one corner of the steel hatch, barely visible beneath rust and dirt, were two faded letters: FTE, Walter Turner. His father had built whatever was hidden beneath that land. Snow drifted slowly across the floodlights, while dozens of people stood around the excavation site in complete silence. Nobody expected the old farmer to step closer to the hatch, but Elias did, carefully, slowly, like a man walking toward a memory he had spent his entire life trying not to disturb. The younger engineers moved aside as he climbed into the trench. Mud cracked beneath his boots, while he knelt beside the steel surface buried under 50 years of frozen Montana soil. His rough fingers brushed across the faded initials again. FTE, Walter Turner. For a long moment, Elias said nothing. Then he whispered quietly to himself, "You actually did it." Carter climbed down behind him impatiently. "You know what this is or not?" Elias ignored the question, because suddenly another memory returned. Summer of 1968. His father welding late at night inside the machine shed, while strange engine parts covered the workbench. Walter had always locked the doors afterward, never explained anything, never answered questions. Back then, Elias thought his father was simply a difficult old mechanic shaped by war. Now he realized Walter had been hiding something much larger. One engineer interrupted the silence. "We tried hydraulic cutters," he explained. "Nothing worked." Another pointed toward the hatch mechanism. "The locking system doesn't make sense. Half the parts look military. The other half look agricultural." Carter scoffed immediately. "Steel is steel. Open the damn thing." But this story was never really about steel. It was about knowledge. And there is a difference between understanding machinery and simply owning expensive tools. Workers brought industrial torque equipment down into the trench. Sparks flew through the cold night, while metal screamed against metal. Nothing moved. By midnight, Carter was furious. "You're telling me a buried door from the 50s beat modern equipment?" The youngest engineer hesitated. "Sir, I don't think this was built like normal infrastructure." Carter snapped back instantly. "Everything man-made can be opened." But Elias kept staring quietly at the mechanism near the lower hinge. Then his expression changed slightly, because mounted beside the locking wheel was an old flywheel assembly taken from a 1948 grain separator. Only a farmer old enough to recognize outdated machinery would notice it. Elias stepped closer. "My father built this to survive winter expansion," he said softly. The engineers looked confused. "What does that mean?" one asked. Elias pointed toward the frozen steel. "In cold weather, the pressure shifts inward. The lock releases differently." Carter laughed loudly from the edge of the trench. So now the farmer's an engineer too. A few workers smirked nervously, but Elias ignored them. He climbed back out of the trench, walked silently toward his truck, and returned carrying an old rusted wrench from behind the seat. The same wrench Walter Turner once carried every day. Elias knelt beside the mechanism again. The crowd watched in silence while snow settled across his shoulders. Then he rotated the flywheel slowly. Nothing happened at first. Carter folded his arms with a smile, but suddenly a deep metallic groan echoed beneath the ground. Several workers stepped backward instantly. Elias adjusted the wheel again. Another heavy thud rolled through the earth. And then, the massive hatch unlocked, just like that. No explosives, no million-dollar equipment. Only an old mechanic's design understood by the son who grew up beside him. For several seconds, nobody moved. Even Carter looked stunned. Then the hatch slowly opened. Cold air rushed upward from underground, carrying the smell of oil, steel, and something untouched for decades. Floodlights were lowered carefully into the darkness below. Concrete walls appeared first, then metal stairs, then something even stranger. Machines, rows of them. The first engineer climbed down holding a flashlight. 2 others followed behind him. At the bottom of the chamber, all 3 men stopped walking. Complete silence filled the excavation site again. Finally, one of them looked upward with disbelief written across his face. "You all need to come down here." One by one, people descended into the underground structure, and the deeper they went, the quieter they became. The chamber stretched beneath the northern ridge like a hidden factory frozen in time. Wooden crates lined the walls. Tool cabinets remained perfectly organized beneath thick layers of dust. Old industrial lights still hung from the ceiling beams, and parked across the center of the underground room sat machines, unlike anything anyone in Elk River had ever seen before. Prototype tractors, experimental engines, massive torque assemblies connected to reinforced transmissions, military-grade farming equipment designed for impossible terrain and extreme weather. Some machines were half dismantled beside drafting tables covered with blueprints and technical notes. Others looked almost ready to start. One engineer opened a crate carefully. Inside were sealed government documents stamped. United States Department of Defense. Another worker uncovered old photographs showing Walter Turner standing beside military engineers sometime during the early 1950s. Carter stared around the chamber, speechless. The rich developer who mocked old machines his entire life suddenly looked like the least knowledgeable man underground. Then another discovery changed everything again. One of the engineers wiped dust from a blueprint tube and unrolled several large papers across a steel workbench. Everyone crowded around. The diagrams showed experimental agricultural engines designed to pull impossible loads through frozen terrain using unusually high low-end torque systems. And signed across the bottom of multiple pages was one name, Walter Turner. The old farmer's father had not simply helped maintain the project. He helped design it. The realization spread through the room slowly. Walter Turner was not some forgotten rural mechanic. He was one of the lead engineers behind an abandoned Cold War agricultural program the government buried decades earlier. And suddenly Elias understood why his father protected the land for so long. Not because the machines were dangerous, because greedy men would eventually come searching for them. Carter recovered first. His eyes moved across the underground facility like a man mentally counting money. "How much is all this worth?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. One older engineer finally removed his glasses. If these prototypes are authentic. He looked around the chamber again. "Billions." Carter smiled instantly. But there was something he still did not understand. And what happened next would destroy everything he thought he owned. By sunrise, the story had spread far beyond Elk River. News vans lined the frozen county road leading to the Turner farm. Reporters stood beside satellite trucks, while drones hovered above the North Ridge, capturing footage of the underground chamber. For the first time in decades, people who once ignored rural Montana suddenly cared about an old farmer and the land beneath his boots. And Carter Hale moved quickly, too quickly. By noon, private security surrounded the excavation site. Lawyers arrived from Billings carrying folders and contracts. Carter stood near the entrance to the underground facility, speaking into his phone almost non-stop. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Elias, not with mockery anymore, with calculation. Because greedy men recognize value faster than anybody else. When Elias walked toward the chamber entrance, carrying a thermos of coffee, one of the guards blocked his path. "Restricted area," the man said. Elias looked at him calmly. "That's my father's work down there." The guard didn't move. Then Carter approached wearing a long black coat and polished boots, untouched by mud. "Things have changed," he said smoothly. Elias stared at him. "No," he answered quietly. "They finally became visible." Carter ignored the remark. "Legally, I own this property now. which means everything beneath it belongs to me. Several reporters nearby immediately turned their cameras toward them. Carter noticed and straightened proudly. I'm willing to be fair. He continued, you needed money. I paid for the land. End of story. But there was something Carter Hale still didn't understand. Old men who survive difficult lives usually learn one important lesson. Never speak too confidently before every document is opened. That afternoon, a retired county clerk named Harold Bennett arrived at the farm carrying 3 dusty archive boxes from the Elk River Records office. Harold was 81 years old and walked with a cane, but his memory remained sharp enough to embarrass younger men. He approached Elias quietly. Your father came to see me once, Harold said. Summer of 1971. Elias frowned slightly. About what? Harold lifted one of the boxes carefully. He told me if anybody ever fought over the Turner land, I should open these. The boxes contained federal contracts, engineering records, military correspondence, and one document that changed everything. In 1954, Walter Turner had signed a confidential partnership agreement with the federal government involving classified agricultural prototypes designed during the Cold War. But buried deep within the contract was one critical detail. The underground facility itself was never transferred with the surface property. Legally, it remained protected under a dormant federal engineering preservation clause tied directly to Walter Turner and his surviving heirs, meaning Carter Hale owned the dirt above it, but not the chamber below. Not the machines, not the blueprints, not the prototypes worth millions. When the attorneys finished reading the documents aloud inside the county courthouse, complete silence filled the room. Carter's face slowly lost color. That's impossible, he said. One federal representative shook his head. No, Mr. Hale, it's very possible. Carter slammed both hands against the table. I bought the land legally, and you received exactly what the contract described. The representative replied calmly. Surface rights only. The reporters in the room immediately began calling their stations. Across town, people gathered outside storefront televisions to watch the hearing unfold live. The same townspeople who once laughed at Elias now stood speechless, listening to lawyers describe Walter Turner as one of the most important agricultural mechanics involved in experimental cold weather engineering during the 1950s. One rancher whispered quietly inside the diner, Walter Turner built all that under our feet, and nobody knew. But the moment nobody forgot came later that afternoon. Carter, furious and desperate, made one final attempt to humiliate Elias publicly. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by cameras, he stepped directly in front of the old farmer. You think this makes you special? Carter snapped. You got lucky because your father buried secrets underground. Elias looked tired more than angry. Snow drifted slowly between them. Then Carter laughed bitterly. You spent your entire life clinging to old machines and dead memories, and now everybody suddenly acts like you're some genius. For several seconds, Elias said nothing. Then he looked toward the distant mountains beyond town. My father used to say something, he answered softly. Carter rolled his eyes. Here we go. Elias continued anyway. He said modern men are always in a hurry to replace things they never took time to understand. The crowd fell silent. Elias looked back at Carter calmly. You saw land, he said. My father saw possibility. Then he walked away while reporters abandoned Carter completely to follow the old farmer instead. That was the exact moment the town turned. Not because Elias became rich, because people finally understood what kind of man he had always been. Weeks later, Clara returned home after successful surgery. The first thing she saw while driving toward the farm was the old 1951 Ford tractor parked outside the restored machine shed beneath fresh snowfall. Elias had bought back part of the original property after federal preservation money arrived. Not all of it, just enough, because he no longer cared about owning everything, only protecting what mattered. Inside the restored underground chamber, historians and engineers carefully cataloged the machines Walter Turner helped design decades earlier. Universities offered Elias money for interviews. Collectors offered fortunes for the prototypes. He refused almost all of them. Instead, he converted part of the old machine shed into a mechanical training workshop for young farmers and small-town mechanics. No fancy tuition, no advertisements, just old tools, hard lessons, and quiet knowledge passed from one generation to another. And hanging above the workshop entrance, Elias placed a wooden sign with words burned carefully into the oak. Old does not mean useless. People traveled from neighboring states to hear the story, not because of the money hidden underground, because deep down, people recognized something missing in modern life: patience, craftsmanship, respect. Carter Hale, meanwhile, lost far more than the excavation project. Banks withdrew from several of his developments after investigators uncovered risky financial deals connected to the failed land purchase. Investors abandoned him quietly. Within 2 years, he sold the Cadillac and most of his commercial holdings. And the strange part was this: Elias never celebrated any of it, never mocked him, never acted victorious. One winter morning, nearly 3 years later, Carter walked alone into the Turner workshop, carrying a broken hydraulic component from an aging loader tractor. The entire room went silent when people recognized him. Carter looked older, smaller somehow. He placed the damaged part on the workbench awkwardly. "I was told you could fix this," he muttered. Elias studied the component quietly beneath the shop light. Then he nodded once. "Sit down," he said. "No revenge, no humiliation. Just an old farmer doing what he had always done, understanding machines better than the men who bought them." And maybe that was the real reason people never forgot the story of Elias Turner. It was never truly about the underground chamber, or the money, or the lost machines. It was about a man the world called outdated, until the world suddenly needed the wisdom he carried all along. Because there will always be people who laugh at old things, old land, old tools, old men. But time has a strange way of revealing value slowly, and sometimes the quietest people are carrying entire histories beneath their feet, while the rest of the world walks over them without ever noticing. On cold evenings in Elk River, people still talk about the morning Elias Turner sold his farm to save his daughter's life. They remember the humiliation, the laughter, the signatures inside the bank, but most of all, they remember what was found beneath the land afterward. Not simply machines buried underground, but proof that wisdom, loyalty, and quiet endurance still matter in a world obsessed with speed and appearances. Because old things are not weak, only forgotten, and forgotten things have a way of waiting patiently until the day somebody finally understands what they were worth all along.